Hello, this is Christopher Porch and my review on the story of Edgar Sawtelle, written in 2008 by David Roborowski. In this book, there are many elements mentioned in Thomas C. Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor that take importance and are major plot points in the story of Edgar Sawtelle. The first element is in the chapter titled, He's Blind for a Reason, You Know. Foster brings up the point that no character is blind without a reason for them being so. Foster points out that blind characters are more observant and sometimes able to see more than normal characters. Or, in other cases, they are blind to something more than just physically. It kind of just depends on the character. In the case of Edgar Sawtelle, the first example of this element is that Glenn is blind to the truth and is constantly believing the lies fed to him. Glenn is unable to see what's right in front of him, which is the fact that Claude is a killer. Because of his blindness and obsessive focus on capturing Edgar to question him, he ends up going blind after chemicals are sprayed in his eyes. This shows the irony in how Glenn wants to see the truth, but is blinded by it once he can. The second example of this is in Edgar himself. Though Edgar isn't blind, he is unable to speak. Edgar is the only person who knows the truth about who killed Gar and why Claude did it to begin with, but he is the only person who's unable to tell anyone. This symbolism helps to show why Edgar might have been mute in the story to begin with. It makes everything he does harder and gives him additional problems to encounter while trying to get Claude caught. Though Edgar is not technically blind, I feel like the same symbolism carries over to being mute. The next element is in the chapter titled, Nice to Eat You, Acts of Vampires. Foster brings up the point that you don't have to be a vampire to have vampiric characteristics. Some characteristics that make up the evilness of a vampire are selfishness, exploitation, and a refusal to respect the autonomy of others. Claude is a perfect example of this in the story of Edgar Sawtelle. He is selfish enough to hate Gar and kill him in order to obtain money, a place to live, and even Trudy, who he attempts to exploit and deceive through lies. Gar is not a vampire either, and he does not hold these characteristics, but ghosts are also mentioned as a chapter in Foster's book. Foster claims that ghosts are about something besides themselves, and are in the story for a greater reason than to just get revenge. This is the case when Gar reappears after his death to Edgar. Gar tells Edgar about what happened and how he died, not for himself, but to protect Edgar and Trudy. To quote Foster's chapter, he's not there to haunt his son, he's there to point out something drastically wrong. He's also seen as a ghost later in the story when Claude is attempting to leave the barn. The same principle is used where the ghost appears, not for himself, but to stop Claude from escaping and deceiving Trudy and Glenn even more after Edgar's death in the barn. The last one of Foster's elements I am bringing up is that standing next to the hero can be bad. Whenever a story is being told, it must continue and progress at a reasonable pace. That being said, after a while, a story can become static, and this is when something needs to happen to move the story along. This can be a death, an injury, or another negative form to give characters new motivation. But will this always happen to the hero? No, it won't. The hero needs to stay alive and well until the end of the story. As Foster wrote, all other characters in a story are simply there to get the hero to their goal. They don't necessarily have to have a deep backstory with great motivations like the hero does. They should, but they don't have to. If a best friend to a main character were to die, of course the main character would be sad, and feel motivated to accomplish some task at hand, regardless of if we knew much about the friend or not. The main character would still be deeply affected. Characters that die in a story are typically flat characters, according to Foster. Characters who we know, but don't always have much dynamic or personality. These flat characters are simply there to help the main characters reach their goals and are chosen for death because of their relationship with the main character. In the story of Edgar Sawtelle, Gar is a good example of standing too close to the hero. Gar's death drives the rest of the plot and story forward to be what it is, and is Edgar's motivation for how he acts for the rest of the story. Gar was chosen for death because that is the character whose death would affect Edgar the most, and would be the most motivation for Edgar to catch the killer. The next character who died was Almondine, the dog. Almondine was Edgar's best and seemingly only friend as he grew up, and was always there for him. While in the woods, Almondine left to find him and died. Almondine was too close to the hero and died so that Edgar could have more motivation at the end of the story, so that Edgar would have the motivation and the drive to be able to catch Claude and to feel remorse for leaving the farm in the first place and leaving all of that behind. So those are Foster's elements that I saw in the story of Edgar Sawtelle. The blindness metaphor can be seen for Glenn and Edgar. The vampiric elements are in Claude, and the Ghost of Gar has the same elements that Foster characterizes to Ghost in his book. And Gar and Almudine were both killed in order to move the plot forward and were standing too close to the hero. There are many other examples of Foster's elements that he wrote in How to Read Literature Like a Professor that are also in the Story of Edgar Sawtelle. Those are just the main ones that I was able to see after reading the Story of Edgar Sawtelle.